Let's start at the very beginning. Not with computers, not with engines, not even with metal. Let's go further back than that. Way, way back. To a time when the most advanced piece of technology on the planet was a rock that someone had hit against another rock until it had a sharp edge. That's where this all starts. And honestly, if you really sit with that idea for a moment, it's one of the most remarkable things that has ever happened on this planet. Because everything traces back to that. The phone you set down before closing your eyes tonight, the building you're lying inside of right now, the electrical grid humming quietly in the walls, the satellites drifting overhead, all of it connects in an unbroken chain to the first time a human ancestor picked up a stone and thought, I can make this better. So let's go there. Let's start in the deep past and just walk forward through time, slowly, no rush, and watch how one invention leads to the next, how problems create solutions that create new problems, how the whole messy, brilliant, sometimes catastrophic story of technology unfolds. And if you drift off somewhere along the way, that's perfectly fine. That's kind of the point. The story will still be here. Okay? So, roughly 2.5 million years ago, give or take, in what's now East Africa, the Great Rift Valley probably, based on where the oldest tools have been found, someone in the genus Homo, maybe Homo habilis, picked up a piece of volcanic rock and struck it against another stone at just the right angle to knock off a flake. What was left behind was a core with a crude but genuinely sharp edge. And what's amazing is that this wasn't random. The fracture patterns on these earliest tools, which archaeologists call Oldowan tools after Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, where they were first identified by Lewis and Mary Leakey in the 1930s, those fracture patterns show intentional, repeated strikes. Whoever made them understood, at least intuitively, that hitting the stone at a particular angle would produce a useful edge. Now think about what that means. That's engineering. It's primitive, sure. There are no calculations, no drawings, no formal understanding of fracture mechanics. But the core principle is already there. You observe the properties of a material, you figure out how to manipulate those properties, and you create something that didn't exist before to solve a problem. In this case, the problem was that human teeth and fingernails aren't great at cutting through animal hide or scraping meat off bone. The solution was a sharp rock, and that solution worked so well that Oldowan tools remained essentially unchanged for about 1 million years. 1 million years of the same basic technology. Let that settle in. We get impatient when our phone is 2 years old. But here's the thing. Even within that enormous stretch of time, something was happening. The tools were getting slightly more refined. The strikes were becoming more controlled. And then, around 1.5 million years ago, a real leap happened. Someone, probably Homo erectus, figured out that instead of just knocking flakes off a core to get a rough edge, you could carefully shape the entire core itself into a tool. Both sides, symmetrically, working all the way around. The result was the Acheulean hand axe, named after Saint Achille in northern France, where examples were first recognized in the 19th century, though the technology itself originated in Africa long before it spread to Europe and Asia. And the Acheulean hand axe is genuinely beautiful. If you've ever seen one in a museum, you know what I mean. It's teardrop-shaped, fits perfectly in the hand, has a balanced weight, and features edges that were knapped with real precision. Some of them are so symmetrical, so carefully made, that archaeologists have debated for decades whether they served a purely functional purpose or whether there was something aesthetic going on too. Whether the makers cared about how the tool looked, not just how it worked. We don't know for sure. But we do know that making one required planning, spatial reasoning, and a mental template. You had to picture the finished tool inside the rough stone, and then execute a sequence of dozens of precise strikes to reveal it. That's not just tool use. Plenty of animals use tools. That's tool design. And this is a pattern we're going to see over and over again as we move through this story. The jump from using something to designing something, from reacting to planning, from solving the problem in front of you, to imagining a problem you haven't encountered yet and building a solution in advance. That cognitive shift, that ability to hold an abstract idea in your mind and then make it real in the physical world, that's the engine underneath all of technology. Every single thing we're going to talk about tonight, from aqueducts to microprocessors, starts with that same basic move. All right, so we've got sharp rocks, we've got hand axes, but let's talk about the other enormous breakthrough happening in this same deep time period, because it changes absolutely everything. Fire. Now, when humans first controlled fire is one of the most debated questions in all of archaeology. There's a site called Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, where researchers have found evidence of burning, ash deposits, charred bone fragments, dating back roughly 1 million years. Some scholars argue for even earlier controlled use, maybe 1.5 million years ago, based on sites in Kenya. Others are more cautious and point out that it's genuinely hard to distinguish a natural wildfire from a deliberately maintained hearth when you're looking at evidence that old. The consensus, if you can call it that, is that Homo erectus was probably using fire in some controlled way by around 1 million years ago, but that the habitual, reliable, everyday use of fire, the kind where every group has a hearth and knows how to start and maintain one, that probably solidified somewhere between 500,000 and 400,000 years ago. But whenever exactly it happened, here's why fire matters so much from a technology standpoint. Fire is the first time humans harnessed an energy source beyond their own muscles, and that's a sentence worth pausing on. Every technology before fire was essentially a way to make human muscle power more effective. A sharp rock lets your arm do something it couldn't do bare-handed. A throwing stick extends your reach. But fire is different. Fire is external energy. It's chemical energy released from wood or bone or dried dung, and once you have it, you can do things that no amount of muscle power could ever accomplish. You can cook food, which breaks down proteins and starches and effectively pre-digests them, meaning your body extracts far more calories from the same amount of food. Some anthropologists, like Richard Wrangham at Harvard, have argued that cooking was so important that it literally drove the evolution of our species, that the extra calories from cooked food allowed our brains to grow larger, which in turn made us better at inventing things, which led to more complex technology, which led to even better food processing. It's a feedback loop. Technology changing biology, changing technology. But cooking is just the start. Fire gives you warmth, which means you can survive in colder climates. It gives you light, which extends the usable hours of the day. It gives you protection from predators. And eventually, thousands of years down the line, fire gives you the ability to transform materials, to harden a wooden spear tip by charring it, to heat treat certain types of stone to make them easier to knap, and much, much later, to smelt metal from ore. That last one, smelting, is so important that we're going to spend a lot of time on it later. But for now, just hold on to this idea. Fire is the first external energy technology, and almost every major technological revolution that follows is really about finding new sources of energy and new ways to use them. Water power, wind power, steam, coal, oil, electricity, nuclear fission. They're all descendants of that first campfire. So now, let's move forward. Let's jump ahead to maybe 100,000 years ago, when anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens, our species, are fully on the scene, and the toolkit is getting more sophisticated. Instead of just core tools like hand axes, people are now making composite tools. That means tools made of multiple parts joined together. A stone point hafted onto a wooden shaft with sinew and tree resin to make a spear. A bone needle with a drilled eye for sewing hides into fitted clothing. These might sound simple, but think about what's involved. You need to select the right stone, shape it into a point, find a suitable shaft, prepare adhesive from plant resin, which itself requires heating and mixing, split the shaft, insert the point, bind it tightly, and let the adhesive cure. That's a multi-step manufacturing process with different materials and different techniques coordinated toward a single product. That's not so different, conceptually, from what happens in a modern factory. The scale is different. The principles are the same. And here's something else that's happening around this time that matters enormously. People are teaching each other. Technology is becoming social. See, you can maybe figure out how to knap a simple flake tool on your own through trial and error. But the more complex the technology gets, the less likely it is that any single individual could reinvent it from scratch. The knowledge has to be passed down, demonstrated, practiced, corrected. This is the beginning of what you might call engineering culture. The idea that technological knowledge lives not in any one person, but in the community, in the accumulated wisdom of generations. And it's fragile. If a small group gets wiped out by disease or disaster before passing on what they know, that knowledge can be lost. And we have evidence that this happened. There are cases in the archaeological record where tool-making traditions seem to get simpler over time in isolated populations, as if skills were being forgotten. Technology isn't a one-way ratchet. It can go backward. It has gone backward. And that's a humbling thing to keep in mind. Now, around 50,000 years ago, something accelerates. Archaeologists sometimes call it the Upper Paleolithic Revolution, though that term is a bit controversial because the changes may have been more gradual than revolution implies, and some of them show up earlier in Africa than in Europe. But whatever you call it, there's a noticeable explosion in the diversity and sophistication of tools, art, and symbolic behavior. You get bone and antler tools, fish hooks, barbed harpoon points, atlatls. Those are spear-throwing devices that effectively extend the length of your arm and let you launch a projectile with much greater force and range. You get cave paintings and carved figurines and personal ornaments made from shells and animal teeth. You get evidence of long-distance trade networks, obsidian and flint traveling hundreds of miles from their source. And this matters for our story because it shows that technology is now deeply embedded in social and economic life. People aren't just making tools for immediate personal use. They're making them for trade. They're specializing. One person becomes especially good at knapping, another at working bone, another at preparing hides. Division of labor. And division of labor is one of those concepts that sounds dry and economic until you realize what it actually means for technology. It means that for the first time, someone can spend most of their time getting really, really good at one thing. And when people specialize, quality goes up, innovation accelerates, and techniques get refined in ways that generalists would never achieve. This is the world on the eve of the biggest transformation in human history. Bigger than fire, bigger than stone tools, bigger even than metal, at least in terms of how fundamentally it restructured human life. And it didn't start with an invention, exactly. It started with a relationship, a slow, deepening relationship between humans and a handful of plant and animal species that would eventually change everything. Because that's what agriculture was. Not a lightning bolt of genius, not someone waking up one morning and deciding to plant a seed. It was a co-evolution. Humans changed the plants, and the plants changed the humans, and neither side fully understood what was happening until it was far too late to go back. Let's talk about what too late to go back actually means, because it's one of the most fascinating traps in all of human history. Picture a group of people, maybe 12,000 years ago, living in the Fertile Crescent, that arc of relatively well-watered land stretching from modern-day Israel up through Lebanon and Syria and curving down through Iraq. These people are hunter-gatherers, but they're not wandering aimlessly. They know their landscape intimately. They know where the wild wheat and barley grow in dense stands. They know when it ripens. They've been harvesting it for generations, maybe thousands of years, using flint-bladed sickles. We've actually found these, with the telltale sheen on the blade edge that comes from cutting silica-rich grass stems. They're already sophisticated. They already have grinding stones to process the grain. They already understand storage, at least in a basic sense. And here's where it gets subtle. When you harvest wild wheat, you're unconsciously selecting for certain traits. Wild wheat has a brittle rachis. That's the little stem that connects each grain to the main stalk. In wild plants, that brittleness is a feature, not a bug. It means the seeds shatter and scatter when they're ripe, which is how the plant reproduces. But if you're a human walking through a field with a sickle, the grains that shatter easily fall to the ground before you can collect them. The ones you actually end up harvesting are the mutant ones, the ones with a slightly tougher rachis that held on a little longer. And then, if you take some of those harvested grains and drop them near your camp, or store them and some spill, or you deliberately scatter some on a promising patch of ground, you're planting seeds that are biased toward non-shattering. Do that for a few hundred years, and you've fundamentally altered the genetics of the plant. You've created something that can't reproduce without human help, because its seeds don't scatter on their own anymore. You've created a domesticate. This is engineering in the deepest sense, even though nobody drew up a blueprint. It's the modification of a natural system to serve human purposes. And the wild wheat doesn't just change its rachis. Over time, under human selection pressure, the seeds get bigger, the plants get more uniform in their ripening time, the hulls become easier to remove. Each of these changes makes the grain more useful to humans and less viable in the wild. The plant becomes dependent on us, and, here's the trap, we become dependent on it. Because once you've invested labor in clearing a field, planting, tending, and harvesting, you can't just walk away. You're tied to that spot. You need to stay to protect your crop from animals, from other people, from weeds. You need to store the harvest, which means you need permanent structures. You need to be there for planting season and harvest season, which means your mobility drops dramatically. And the cruel irony is that early farmers were probably less healthy than the hunter-gatherers they descended from. Skeletal evidence from early agricultural sites shows more nutritional deficiencies, more dental problems from starchy diets, more signs of repetitive strain from grinding grain. Heights actually decreased. Life expectancy may have dropped. So why did anyone do it? The honest answer is that it probably wasn't a conscious choice. It was a ratchet. Each small step made sense in the moment. Harvest a little more grain, store a little more, settle a little longer, clear a little more ground. And each step made it harder to go back. And the thing about agriculture, is that it supports more people per unit of land than hunting and gathering does. So populations grew. And once your population has grown to the point where the land can only support that many people through farming, you can't return to foraging. There aren't enough wild resources for that many mouths. You're locked in. This happened independently in at least 7 or 8 places around the world. The Fertile Crescent, with wheat, barley, lentils, sheep, and goats, starting roughly 10 to 12,000 years ago. China, where rice was domesticated along the Yangtze River around 9,000 years ago, and millet in the north around the same time. Mesoamerica, where maize was slowly coaxed out of a wild grass called teosinte, and that transformation is so dramatic that for a long time botanists couldn't even agree that teosinte was the ancestor of corn because they look so different. The Andes, with potatoes and llamas, West Africa with sorghum and pearl millet, New Guinea with taro and yams. Each of these was an independent experiment in the same basic process, humans entering into a feedback loop with certain species, each side reshaping the other. Now, here's what matters for the history of technology. Agriculture didn't just change what people ate. It changed everything about how human societies were organized, and that reorganization created the conditions for almost every subsequent technological development. Think about it. Settled life means permanent buildings, which means architecture and construction techniques. Surplus food means not everyone has to farm, which means some people can specialize full-time in making pottery or weaving textiles or smelting metal, or, and this is a big one, administering and governing. Surplus also means something worth stealing, which means warfare becomes more organized, which drives military technology. And surplus needs to be tracked, which eventually drives the development of counting systems and writing. Let's slow down on that pottery point for a moment, because ceramics are one of those technologies that seem humble, but are actually revolutionary. The oldest known ceramic objects are figurines from what's now the Czech Republic, around 26,000 years old. So people understood that you could shape wet clay and harden it with fire long before agriculture. But pottery vessels, the kind you store grain and water in, those show up in Japan around 16,000 years ago with the Jomon culture, and in the Near East a bit later, becoming widespread with early farming communities. And here's what's really clever about a pot. It's a container you can put directly on fire. That means you can boil water for the first time. You can cook grains into porridge, which makes them far more digestible and calorie accessible. You can render fat, brew fermented drinks, store oils. A pot is a chemical processing plant. It's a reactor vessel. And making a good pot requires understanding material science in a practical way. Which clays hold up, how thick to make the walls, how fast to dry it before firing, what temperature to fire at, whether to add temper like sand or crushed shell to prevent cracking. Potters developed this knowledge empirically over thousands of years, and it's the direct ancestor of the ceramic engineering that today gives us everything from bathroom tiles to the heat shields on spacecraft. But let's come back to the social transformation, because that's where the really dramatic technological consequences emerge. When you have settled agricultural communities growing in size, you eventually get something that had never existed before on Earth: cities. And the first real cities, the ones with thousands of people living in close proximity, with specialized occupations and centralized administration, those appear in Mesopotamia, in what's now southern Iraq, starting around 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. Uruk is the classic example. By around 3,500 BCE, Uruk may have had 40,000 people. 40,000 people in one place, in the 4th millennium BCE. Think about the engineering challenges that creates. You need water. Southern Mesopotamia is flat, hot, and dry, but it has two enormous rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. The water is there, but it's not where you need it, and it doesn't come when you need it. The rivers flood in spring, which is actually the wrong time for the growing season, so you need irrigation, canals to divert water, levees to control flooding, reservoirs to store water for later use. And these are not trivial engineering projects. Some of the early Sumerian canals stretched for miles. They required coordinated labor, dozens, maybe hundreds of people digging and maintaining them. They required planning, surveying, understanding of water flow and gradients. If your canal doesn't have the right slope, the water doesn't flow, or it flows too fast and erodes the channel. Too little slope and it silts up. The Sumerians figured this out through trial and error over centuries, and their irrigation systems were sophisticated enough to support dense populations in a landscape that would otherwise be near desert. But irrigation has a hidden cost, and this is one of those slow-motion engineering failures that's worth understanding. When you irrigate in a hot, arid climate, water evaporates from the soil surface, and as it evaporates, it leaves behind dissolved salts. Over years and decades and centuries, those salts accumulate. The soil becomes saline, crop yields drop, and the Sumerians experienced exactly this. There's evidence in their own records. Early texts mention wheat and barley being grown in roughly equal proportions. By about 2500 BCE, wheat, which is less salt-tolerant, had almost disappeared from southern Mesopotamian agriculture, replaced entirely by the hardier barley. And eventually, even barley yields declined. Some historians argue that salinization was a major factor in the decline of Sumerian civilization and the shift of power northward to Babylon and Assyria, where the land hadn't been irrigated as long. It's a sobering reminder that engineering solutions can create new problems that only become visible on timescales longer than a human lifetime. And while we're in Mesopotamia, we have to talk about what might be the most consequential information technology ever invented, because it was born right here, right out of the practical needs of managing agricultural surplus. Writing. The earliest writing we know of comes from Uruk, around 3400 to 3100 BCE, and it's not poetry, it's not mythology, it's not love letters, it's accounting, it's records of grain stored, animals counted, rations distributed, little clay tablets pressed with a reed stylus, creating the wedge-shaped marks we call cuneiform. And before even that, there were clay tokens, small shaped pieces representing specific commodities, a cone for a small measure of grain, a sphere for a large measure, a cylinder for an animal. These tokens go back to around 8000 BCE, so people were using physical symbols to track economic information for thousands of years before anyone thought to press those symbols into a flat tablet. Think about what writing means for technology. Before writing, all knowledge was stored in human memory and transmitted orally. That works, but it's fragile. Remember what we talked about earlier, how isolated populations can lose technologies. Writing changes that equation fundamentally. Now you can record a technique, a measurement, a recipe, a design, and it persists beyond any individual life. You can transmit exact information across distance without relying on a chain of human messengers who might garble the message. You can accumulate knowledge across generations in a way that oral tradition simply cannot match. Writing is, in a very real sense, the technology that makes all subsequent technological acceleration possible. It's external memory. It's the first hard drive. And it's not just Mesopotamia. Writing was independently invented in at least 3, possibly 4 places, Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, and Mesoamerica. Each system looks completely different, but each emerged in the context of complex societies that needed to manage information beyond what human memory could handle. Egypt's hieroglyphic system appears around 3200 BCE, possibly slightly later than Sumerian cuneiform, though the dating is debated, and some Egyptologists argue for independent invention rather than diffusion from Mesopotamia. Chinese writing shows up on oracle bones from the Shang dynasty around 1200 BCE, though it may have earlier precursors that haven't survived. And Mesoamerican writing systems, including Olmec and later Maya glyphs, developed entirely independently in the Americas. But let's stay in the ancient Near East for a moment longer, because something else is happening here that's going to reshape the entire trajectory of human technology. Something that starts with a greenish stone and a very hot fire. Because right around the time that cities are forming and writing is being invented, people are figuring out how to extract metal from rock. And that discovery, that you can take a dull, unpromising-looking ore, heat it to extraordinary temperatures, and pull from it a gleaming, malleable, endlessly useful substance. That discovery is going to change everything. Because up until this point, every tool humans have ever made has been shaped by subtraction. You take a rock, and you chip pieces away. You take a piece of wood and you carve it down. You take a bone and you grind it into shape. You're always removing material to get closer to the form you want. But metal lets you do something completely new. You can melt it, pour it, cast it into any shape you can imagine. You can hammer it thin, bend it, join pieces together. And if the thing you made breaks or you don't like it anymore, you can melt it back down and start over. That's revolutionary. That's a material you can think with in a completely different way. Now, the first metal humans used wasn't smelted at all. It was native copper that occurs naturally in its metallic form, just sitting there in certain geological deposits, looking like a reddish lump of something clearly different from the surrounding stone. People in several parts of the world figured out that this stuff could be hammered into shape without heating it. There's evidence of cold-worked native copper from southeastern Turkey dating to around 8000 BCE, which is astonishingly early. We're talking about people in the early Neolithic, still figuring out agriculture, picking up these reddish nuggets and pounding them into beads and small tools. Similar early copperworking shows up at Çayönü Tepesi and other Anatolian sites. But native copper is rare, and cold hammering has limits. You can make small ornaments, pins, simple awls. You can't make much that's truly useful for heavy work, because the copper work hardens as you hammer it. It gets brittle and cracks. People eventually figured out that if you heat the copper, it becomes soft again, and you can keep working it. That's annealing, and it was an important step. But the real game changer, the thing that opens the door to an entirely new technological era, is smelting. The realization that you can take certain greenish or bluish stones, like malachite or azurite, put them in a very hot charcoal fire, and metallic copper will flow out of them. Think about what a conceptual leap that is. You're looking at a green rock. It doesn't look anything like metal. There's no obvious reason to think that metal is hiding inside it. And yet somehow, probably through a combination of accident and observation, maybe a piece of malachite fell into a pottery kiln. Maybe someone noticed odd metallic beads in the ashes of a particularly hot fire. People made the connection. And here's where the story of ceramics that we talked about earlier loops back in, because the technology of pottery kilns is almost certainly what made smelting possible. Remember, those early potters had already figured out how to build enclosed firing structures that could reach temperatures of 900 to 1,000 degrees Celsius. Copper melts at 1,085 degrees Celsius, but copper smelting from oxide ores, like malachite, can actually begin at somewhat lower temperatures in a reducing atmosphere, meaning an environment starved of oxygen, which is exactly what you get in a charcoal-filled kiln. So the infrastructure was already there. The people who figured out smelting weren't starting from scratch. They were building on thousands of years of accumulated knowledge about fire management, kiln construction, and the behavior of materials at high temperatures. The earliest convincing evidence of copper smelting comes from sites in the Balkans and Anatolia, dating to roughly 5,000 BCE, give or take a few centuries depending on the site and how you interpret the evidence. There's a remarkable site called Belovod in modern-day Serbia, where copper smelting slag, the waste material from smelting, has been dated to around 5,000 BCE, making it one of the oldest known smelting operations anywhere. And it's worth noting that this is happening in southeastern Europe, not in Mesopotamia, which reminds us that technological innovation doesn't always originate where we might expect. But copper by itself has a problem. It's soft. You can make beautiful ornaments from it, and certain tools, awls, chisels, small knives, work reasonably well, but a copper axe won't hold an edge the way a well-knapped flint axe will. For heavy cutting work, stone is honestly better, so for a long time, copper exists alongside stone tools rather than replacing them. Archaeologists call this the Chalcolithic period, the Copperstone Age, and it's a useful reminder that new technologies don't instantly sweep away old ones. There's always overlap, always a long period where the new thing coexists with what came before, each used where it works best. Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Sometime around 3,300 BCE, give or take, people discover that if you add a small amount of tin to molten copper, roughly 10%, you get something dramatically different. You get bronze. And bronze is harder than copper. It casts more cleanly because it has a lower melting point and flows better into molds. It holds a sharper edge, and it's more resistant to corrosion. Bronze is, by almost every practical measure, a superior material. And its discovery kicks off what we call the Bronze Age, which will reshape societies across Eurasia for the next 2,000 years. Now, the tin thing is genuinely puzzling from a historical perspective. Tin ore, cassiterite, doesn't look like copper ore, doesn't occur in the same places, and tin itself is a relatively rare element in the Earth's crust. How did someone figure out that adding this specific, uncommon metal to copper would produce a superior alloy? There are a few theories. One is that some copper ores naturally contain small amounts of tin, and smelting those ores produced a noticeably better metal, which led to experimentation. Another is that tin was already known as a curiosity. It's a pretty metal, silvery and shiny, and someone tried adding it to a copper melt just to see what would happen. We honestly don't know for certain. But however it happened, the consequences were enormous. And here's where technology intersects with economics and politics in a way that's going to become a recurring pattern throughout all of human history. Because tin is rare, copper is relatively abundant. You can find copper ores in lots of places, but tin deposits are concentrated in just a few locations: Cornwall in southwestern England, parts of Central Europe, Afghanistan, and a few spots in Southeast Asia. This means that to make bronze, you need long-distance trade networks. You need to move tin hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles from where it's mined to where the bronze is being cast. And that requirement, that geographic mismatch between where the raw materials are and where the demand is, creates trade routes, creates wealth, creates political power for whoever controls those routes, and creates vulnerability for civilizations that depend on them. The great Bronze Age civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean, Mycenaean Greece, the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, New Kingdom Egypt, the trading cities of the Levant like Ugarit, were all enmeshed in these networks. And when those networks collapsed, around 1200 BCE, in what historians call the Late Bronze Age collapse, the consequences were catastrophic. This is one of the most dramatic and debated events in ancient history. Within a span of about 50 years, almost every major civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean either collapsed entirely or was severely diminished. The Mycenaean palace centers were destroyed. The Hittite Empire vanished. Ugarit was burned and never reoccupied. Egypt survived but was permanently weakened. International trade dried up. Writing systems were lost. Linear B, the script of Mycenaean Greece, disappeared, and Greece entered a period of several centuries with no writing at all, sometimes called the Greek Dark Ages. What caused it? There's no single answer, and scholars have been arguing about it for decades. The ancient sources mention invasions by mysterious sea peoples, and there's archaeological evidence of widespread destruction. But there were also severe droughts, earthquakes, internal rebellions, and, crucially, disruption of those tin trade networks we just talked about. The systems had become so interconnected, so dependent on the smooth flow of materials across vast distances, that when things started going wrong in one area, the failures cascaded. It's a pattern that should feel familiar to anyone who lived through the supply chain disruptions of recent years. Complexity creates capability, but it also creates fragility. But here's the thing about collapse. It's never the end of the story, because out of the wreckage of the Bronze Age, something new emerges. Something that had been around for a while but hadn't been practical enough to matter much. Iron. Now, people had known about iron for a long time before the Bronze Age collapse. There are scattered iron artifacts dating back to the 3rd millennium BCE, but most of those were made from meteoric iron that literally fell from the sky in meteorites. Meteoric iron is identifiable because it contains a high percentage of nickel, which terrestrial iron typically doesn't. King Tutankhamun, who died around 1323 BCE, was buried with an iron dagger that chemical analysis has confirmed was made from meteoric iron. It was a prestige object, rarer and more exotic than gold. Smelting iron from terrestrial ore is a much harder problem than smelting copper. Iron ore is abundant, far more common than copper ore. But iron has a much higher melting point, around 1,538 degrees Celsius. Bronze Age furnaces couldn't reach that temperature. So how did people start working iron? The answer is that early iron workers didn't actually melt the iron. They used a process called bloomery smelting, where iron ore is heated with charcoal in a forced draft furnace to temperatures of around 1,200 degrees Celsius. At that temperature, the iron doesn't melt, but the slag does, and the iron particles stick together into a spongy mass called a bloom. The bloom is then pulled from the furnace and repeatedly hammered while still hot, which squeezes out the trapped slag and consolidates the metal. It's a laborious process, and the resulting iron is honestly not much better than bronze. It's about the same hardness, and it's more prone to rust. So why did iron take over? 2 reasons, and they're both practical rather than purely technical. First, iron ore is everywhere. You don't need those fragile long-distance tin trade networks. Any community with access to bog iron or iron-bearing rock, which is most communities, can produce iron locally. When the Bronze Age trade networks collapsed, iron became the material you could actually get your hands on. Second, iron workers eventually figured out that if you heat iron in contact with charcoal for extended periods, carbon atoms migrate into the surface of the metal, creating a material we now call steel. Early steelmaking was inconsistent and poorly understood. Smiths knew that certain techniques produced harder iron, but they didn't know why in chemical terms. They developed elaborate rituals and closely guarded trade secrets around the process. Some of those secrets were remarkably effective. There are accounts of quenching hot iron in various liquids, water, oil, even urine. And each produces different results because the cooling rate affects the crystal structure of the metal. A fast quench in cold water produces very hard but brittle steel. A slower cool in oil produces something tougher and more flexible. And this is where the blacksmith becomes one of the most important figures in the ancient world. Think about it. The smith is the person who understands fire, who understands metal, who can take raw earth and transform it into weapons, tools, plowshares, nails, hinges, locks, horseshoes. In many cultures, smiths occupied a special social position, sometimes revered, sometimes feared, often set apart. The Greek god Hephaestus, the Norse dwarves who forged Thor's hammer, the legendary swords of Celtic and Japanese tradition. These mythologies reflect the genuine awe that metalworking inspired, because if you don't understand the chemistry, it really does look like magic. You take dull red dirt, you subject it to fire and force, and out comes gleaming metal that can cut, that can hold an edge, that can be shaped into anything. The transition from bronze to iron happened at different rates in different places. In the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East, it was largely complete by around 900 BCE. In sub-Saharan Africa, interestingly, iron smelting appears to have developed independently. There's evidence of iron production in parts of Nigeria and the Great Lakes region of East Africa dating to at least 800 BCE, and possibly earlier, without a preceding Bronze Age at all. Some African societies went directly from stone tools to iron, which challenges the old assumption that technological development always follows a neat progression from copper to bronze to iron. By the time we reach the classical civilizations, Greece, Rome, Persia, Han China, the Maurya Empire, iron and steel are the backbone of military and economic power. Roman legions conquered the Mediterranean world with iron swords, iron-tipped javelins called pila, and iron nails holding together the ships and siege engines that projected Roman power across 3 continents. Roman engineering, in fact, is where we should turn our attention next, because the Romans represent something genuinely new in the history of technology, not so much in terms of fundamental invention, but in terms of systematic large-scale application. The Romans weren't always the first to figure something out, but they were arguably the first civilization to deploy engineering solutions at a truly imperial scale, building infrastructure that would remain unmatched for over 1,000 years. And the thing they built that still astonishes engineers today, the thing that tells you everything you need to know about how they thought about problems, is their water supply. The aqueducts. Not because aqueducts were the most complex thing the Romans ever built. You could make a case for their concrete harbors or their road network. But because the aqueducts reveal a way of thinking about engineering that was, for its time, almost shockingly modern. They saw a problem. A city of 1 million people needs an enormous, reliable supply of fresh water. And they solved it with precision, patience, and an almost obsessive attention to gradient. Here's the basic challenge. Rome sits on the Tiber River. But by the 4th century, BCE, the Tiber was increasingly polluted and unreliable as a sole water source for a growing population. Springs within the city weren't enough either. So the Romans did what seems obvious in hindsight. but was genuinely audacious at the time. They went and found clean water sources in the hills and mountains surrounding Rome, some of them 50, 60, even 90 kilometers away, and they built channels to bring that water downhill into the city, using nothing but gravity. No pumps, no engines, just the steady, patient pull of the earth, harnessed through carefully calculated slopes. The first aqueduct, the Aqua Appia, was built in 312 BCE by the censor Appius Claudius Caecus, the same guy who started construction of the Appian Way, that famous road. The Aqua Appia ran mostly underground, about 16 kilometers from its source to the city, and it worked beautifully. But here's what's really impressive about the engineering. The gradient, the slope of the channel, had to be precisely controlled. Too steep, and the water flows too fast, eroding the channel and arriving with destructive force. Too shallow, and the water barely moves, or pools, or stops flowing altogether. The Romans aimed for gradients of roughly 1 to 2 meters of drop per kilometer of channel length. Think about that. Over a distance of, say, 50 kilometers, the total elevation change might be only 50 to 100 meters. That's a slope so gentle you could barely perceive it with your eyes. And they maintained that slope across valleys, around hillsides, through tunnels bored into solid rock, over arched bridges, consistently, kilometer after kilometer. By the height of the empire, Rome was served by 11 major aqueducts, delivering something like 1 million cubic meters of water per day. 1 million cubic meters. That's roughly 260 million gallons. For context, that's comparable to the water supply of a modern city of similar size. Some historians have calculated that per capita water availability in Imperial Rome may have actually exceeded that of many European cities well into the 19th century. Let that sink in for a moment. People in London in 1850 may have had less reliable access to clean water than Romans did in 100 CE, and the aqueducts are just one piece of the Roman infrastructure story. The roads are another. By the peak of the empire, the Roman road network stretched something like 400,000 kilometers, roughly the distance from the Earth to the Moon. These weren't dirt paths. The major roads were engineered structures, typically built in layers, a foundation of large stones, then smaller stones and gravel, then a surface layer of fitted stone slabs or packed gravel, with drainage ditches on either side. They were crowned, slightly higher in the center, so rainwater would run off to the sides. Some of these roads survived for centuries after the fall of Rome, and a few are still in use today, buried under modern pavement. The road from London to Dover follows a route the Romans laid out. Parts of the Appian Way, built in 312 BCE, are still walkable. Now you might be thinking, okay, roads and aqueducts, that's impressive, but it's just civil engineering. It's just moving dirt and stacking stones. And sure, on one level that's true. But the Romans also made a breakthrough in materials science that's arguably one of the most important in all of engineering history. And it happened almost by accident, or at least through empirical tinkering rather than theoretical understanding. They invented hydraulic concrete. Roman concrete, opus caementitium, was a mixture of volcanic ash, lime, and seawater, combined with chunks of rock as aggregate. The volcanic ash was the key ingredient. The Romans discovered, probably through trial and error, that a particular type of volcanic ash found near the town of Puteoli, modern Pozzuoli, near Naples, had remarkable properties when mixed with lime and water. It would set even underwater. This is huge. Ordinary lime mortar won't cure underwater. It needs air. But Roman concrete, because of the chemical reaction between the volcanic ash and the lime in the presence of seawater, formed a material that actually got stronger over time when submerged. Modern analysis has shown that seawater percolating through Roman concrete promotes the growth of mineral crystals, specifically a rare mineral called aluminum tobermorite, that reinforce the structure at a microscopic level. The concrete literally heals itself. This is why the harbor at Caesarea Maritima, built by Herod the Great around 25 BCE using Roman concrete techniques, lasted for centuries despite being pounded by Mediterranean waves. It's why the Pantheon in Rome, built around 125 CE under the Emperor Hadrian, still stands today with the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world, 43 meters across, almost 142 feet, a record it held for over 1,300 years. The dome of the Pantheon is a masterpiece of practical engineering. It's thickest at the base, about 6 meters, and tapers to just 1.5 meters at the top, where the oculus, that famous open hole, lets in light and, yes, rain, which drains away through subtle floor drains. The aggregate changes as you go up the dome. Heavy basalt and travertine at the bottom, lighter pumice near the top, reducing the weight where the structural stresses are greatest. The Romans didn't have finite element analysis software. They didn't have structural engineering equations. But they understood, through accumulated experience, and probably some spectacular failures we don't know about, how to distribute loads through a curved structure. And then, remarkably, the recipe for this concrete was lost. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, the knowledge of how to make hydraulic concrete, the specific ratios, the right volcanic ash, the curing process, disappeared from European practice for roughly 1,000 years. Think about what that means. A material technology that was demonstrably superior to anything that would be available again until the 18th or 19th century. Just gone. Not because it was a secret, exactly, but because the institutional knowledge, the supply chains, the trained workforce, the economic system that supported large-scale construction, all of it fell apart. Technology isn't just knowledge in someone's head. It's an entire ecosystem of skills, materials, institutions, and economic incentives. Remove the ecosystem, and even well-documented knowledge can become effectively useless. This is one of the great lessons of technological history, and it applies far beyond Rome. The same thing happened with Greek fire, that incendiary weapon used by the Byzantine Empire. The recipe was lost. It happened with Damascus steel, those legendary sword blades with their distinctive watered patterns. The exact production technique was lost by the 18th century, and modern metallurgists have only recently begun to understand what made them special, involving carbon nanotubes that formed during a very specific smelting process using particular Indian ores. Knowledge is fragile. Civilizations can go backward. But let's stay with this idea of what happened after Rome, because the popular narrative, that Europe plunged into 1,000 years of darkness where nothing happened technologically, is wrong. Deeply wrong. It's one of those stories that's so satisfying and simple that it persists despite being contradicted by the evidence. The medieval period, roughly 500 to 1500 CE, was actually a time of significant technological innovation in Europe, and even more so in the Islamic world and in China. Let's start with China, because honestly, the technological achievements of medieval China are staggering, and they don't get nearly enough attention in Western accounts of engineering history. By the Song dynasty, which ran from 960 to 1279 CE, China was arguably the most technologically advanced civilization on Earth. The list of Chinese innovations is almost absurdly long. Paper, which was invented during the Han Dynasty around the 2nd century CE, but refined and mass-produced during the Tong and Song. Woodblock printing, which appeared by the 7th century. Movable type, invented by Bi Sheng around 1040 CE, 400 years before Gutenberg. Gunpowder, which Chinese alchemists stumbled upon around the 9th century while searching for an elixir of immortality, which is a beautifully ironic origin story for a substance that would eventually kill millions. The magnetic compass, which Chinese navigators were using by the 11th century. Mechanical clocks driven by water-powered escapement mechanisms built by Su Song around 1088 CE, towering structures that tracked astronomical movements with remarkable precision. And here's what's fascinating about Chinese technological development. It was often driven by the state. The imperial bureaucracy needed standardized measurements, reliable communications, accurate calendars for agriculture and ritual. The government invested in technology because technology served administrative power. This is a pattern you see again and again throughout history. Technological development follows incentive structures. The Romans built roads because they needed to move legions quickly. The Chinese developed printing partly because the imperial examination system required the mass reproduction of texts. Technology doesn't advance in a vacuum. It advances because someone, a government, a merchant, a military, needs it to solve a specific problem. Meanwhile, in the Islamic world, from roughly the 8th to the 14th century, an extraordinary flourishing of science and engineering was underway. The Abbasid Caliphate, centered in Baghdad, deliberately sought out and translated Greek, Persian, Indian, and Chinese texts, creating a vast synthesis of knowledge that scholars then built upon. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, established in the early 9th century, was essentially a research institution and translation center that preserved and extended classical knowledge that would otherwise have been lost to Europe entirely. Al-Khwarizmi, working there around 820 CE, wrote the treatise that gave us the word algebra and systematized methods of solving equations that engineers still use today. His name, Latinized, gives us the word algorithm. But beyond pure mathematics, Islamic engineers made remarkable practical contributions. Al-Jazari, working in what is now southeastern Turkey, around 1206, wrote a book called, and I love this title, The Book of Knowledge of Ingenious Mechanical Devices, which described dozens of automata, water clocks, water-raising machines, and mechanical devices of astonishing sophistication. One of his water clocks featured automated figures that moved, doors that opened, birds that sang, all powered by water and gravity, using camshafts, gear trains, and feedback mechanisms that wouldn't be seen in Europe for centuries. His work on crankshafts and connecting rods, converting rotary motion to reciprocating motion and back, anticipated mechanisms that would become fundamental to the steam engine 500 years later. And this brings us to something crucial about how technology actually progresses across civilizations. Ideas travel. They travel through trade routes, through conquest, through the movement of craftspeople and scholars, through books and translations. The Silk Road wasn't just carrying silk and spices, it was carrying knowledge. When European scholars in the 12th and 13th centuries began translating Arabic texts into Latin, they weren't just recovering lost Greek knowledge. They were receiving that knowledge transformed, extended, enriched by centuries of Islamic scholarship and practical engineering. The numerals we call Arabic were actually Indian in origin, transmitted and refined through Islamic mathematics before reaching Europe. The astrolabe, perfected by Islamic astronomers, became an essential navigation tool for European sailors. Technology has always been a conversation between civilizations, not a monologue. And in medieval Europe itself, far from stagnating, engineers and craftspeople were making innovations that would lay the groundwork for the Industrial Revolution still centuries away. The heavy plow, fitted with a coulter, a horizontal share, and a moldboard, transformed northern European agriculture by allowing farmers to turn the dense, clay-rich soils that the lighter Mediterranean scratch plow couldn't handle. The horse collar, adopted from China via Central Asia around the 9th or 10th century, allowed horses to pull heavy loads without choking, a simple change in harness design that dramatically increased agricultural productivity. Watermills proliferated across Europe. The Domesday Book of 1086 recorded over 6,000 watermills in England alone, grinding grain, fulling cloth, powering bellows for forges. And then came the windmill, appearing in northern Europe by the late 12th century, harnessing a power source that was available even where rivers weren't. But perhaps the most consequential medieval European innovation, the one that would, more than any other single technology, reshape human civilization, was happening in a workshop in Mainz, Germany, around the year 1440, where a goldsmith named Johannes Gutenberg was trying to solve what seemed like a fairly modest problem: how to print books faster and cheaper than the monks who copied them by hand. He wasn't the first person to think about mechanical printing. The Chinese and Koreans had been doing it for centuries, but Gutenberg brought together a combination of innovations that, taken together, created something genuinely revolutionary. He combined a durable metal alloy for the type itself, a mixture of lead, tin, and antimony that melted at a low enough temperature to cast easily, but held up under repeated pressure, with a precision mold that let him produce individual letters quickly and uniformly, each one exactly the same height so they'd sit flush on the page. He adapted the screw press, a device already well known in winemaking and olive oil production across Europe, into a printing press that could apply firm, even pressure across a full sheet. And he developed an oil-based ink that would adhere to metal type in a way that the water-based inks used in woodblock printing simply couldn't. None of these individual elements was entirely new, but the system Gutenberg built from them, that was new, and it changed everything. Think about the economics for a second. Before Gutenberg, producing a single copy of the Bible took a scribe roughly 2 to 3 years of painstaking work. The cost was enormous. Books were chained to library desks because each one represented a small fortune. Gutenberg's workshop could produce a Bible, the famous 42-line Bible, so called because of the number of lines per page, in a matter of weeks per copy, and he printed around 180 of them in his first run, around 1455. Within 50 years of Gutenberg's press, an estimated 20 million volumes had been printed across Europe. By 1500, there were printing operations in over 250 cities. The price of books plummeted. Ideas that had been locked away in monasteries and royal libraries suddenly became available to anyone with a few coins and the ability to read. And here's the thing: the availability of books itself drove literacy. When there's nothing to read, why learn? When books are everywhere, reading becomes a practical skill worth acquiring. The ripple effects are almost impossible to overstate. Martin Luther's 95 Theses in 1517 would have been just another theological complaint nailed to a church door if not for the printing press. Instead, Copies spread across Germany within weeks and across Europe within months. The Protestant Reformation, whatever you think of its theology, was fundamentally a media event, the first viral phenomenon in European history. Scientific knowledge could now accumulate in a way it never had before. When Copernicus published his model of the solar system in 1543, it reached astronomers across the continent. When errors were found, corrections could be published and distributed. Knowledge stopped being something you carried in your head or copied by hand from a single precious manuscript. It became something that existed in hundreds or thousands of identical copies, distributed across cities and countries, resistant to loss. Remember how we talked about Roman concrete knowledge simply vanishing when the social infrastructure collapsed? The printing press made that kind of catastrophic knowledge loss far, far harder. Not impossible, but harder. And this brings us to something worth sitting with for a moment, because it connects to a much larger pattern in the story of technology. The printing press didn't just spread existing knowledge faster, it changed the kind of knowledge that could exist. When you can publish tables of data, astronomical observations, tide charts, mathematical tables, and distribute identical copies to researchers in different cities, you get something new: collaborative, cumulative science. Tycho Brahe's meticulous astronomical observations, recorded and published in the late 1500s, could be studied by Johannes Kepler in a different city after Brahe's death. Kepler could trust that his copy of the data matched everyone else's copy. That seems trivial, but it's not. Before printing, every copy introduced errors. Every hand transcription was a game of telephone. Printing didn't eliminate errors entirely, but it standardized them. Everyone was working from the same page, literally. So now we're in the 16th and 17th centuries, and something extraordinary is building. The combination of accumulated knowledge, printed books, improving instruments, and a growing culture of systematic observation is producing what we now call the scientific revolution. And here's where technology and science start feeding each other in a way that accelerates both beyond anything that came before. Take the telescope. In 1608, a Dutch spectacle maker named Hans Lippershey applied for a patent on a device that made distant objects appear closer. Within a year, Galileo Galilei in Italy had heard about the idea, built his own improved version, and pointed it at the sky. What he saw, the moons of Jupiter, the phases of Venus, the craters of our own moon, didn't just challenge the old Aristotelian cosmology. It demonstrated something profound about the relationship between tools and knowledge. The moons of Jupiter had always been there. They'd been orbiting for billions of years, but no human being had ever known about them because no human being had ever had a tool that could reveal them. The telescope didn't just magnify light, it magnified the reach of human understanding itself. And this is a pattern you see again and again from this point forward. Better tools reveal new phenomena. New phenomena demand new theories. New theories suggest new tools. The microscope, developed around the same time as the telescope, revealed a world of tiny organisms that no one had imagined existed. Antony van Leeuwenhoek, a Dutch draper with no formal scientific training, ground his own lenses in the 1670s and became the first human being to see bacteria. He called them animalcules, little animals. He had no framework for understanding what they were or what they did. It would take another 2 centuries before germ theory connected those tiny organisms to disease. But the observation came first, made possible by the tool. Now let's talk about something that was happening simultaneously, something more immediately practical, but equally transformative. While natural philosophers were peering through telescopes and microscopes, engineers and entrepreneurs were wrestling with a very specific, very urgent problem: how to pump water out of mines. This might sound mundane compared to discovering the moons of Jupiter, but stay with me, because this problem, this boring, practical, dirty problem of flooded mine shafts, is where the Industrial Revolution actually begins. By the late 1600s, England's demand for coal was growing rapidly. London had largely switched from wood to coal for heating, and the easily accessible surface deposits were running out. Miners had to dig deeper, and the deeper they dug, the more groundwater flooded in. Pumping water by hand or with horse-driven pumps was expensive and limited. What they needed was a machine that could pump continuously, powerfully, and cheaply. In 1698, Thomas Savery patented what he called the miner's friend, a steam-driven pump that used the condensation of steam to create a partial vacuum, which would draw water upward. It was clever, but it had serious limitations. It could only lift water about 30 feet. It had no moving parts beyond valves that tended to leak, and the vessels had to withstand high-pressure steam, which sometimes meant they exploded. Not ideal. Then came Thomas Newcomen. Newcomen was an ironmonger from Dartmouth in Devon. Not a gentleman scientist, not a university man, just a practical tradesman who understood what miners needed, because he sold them their tools. Around 1712, Newcomen built the first truly practical steam engine, and it's worth understanding how it worked because the principle is beautiful in its simplicity. A large cylinder contained a piston. Steam from a boiler filled the cylinder, pushing the piston up. Then cold water was sprayed into the cylinder, condensing the steam and creating a partial vacuum. Atmospheric pressure, just the weight of the air above, pushed the piston back down. That downward stroke was connected to a rocking beam, which was connected to a pump rod that went down into the mine. Up, down, slow, steady, tireless. It was astonishingly inefficient. Something like 99% of the heat energy in the coal was wasted. But here's the thing. It didn't matter. The engine was sitting right next to a coal mine. Fuel was essentially free. What mattered was that it worked reliably, hour after hour, day after day, without horses that needed feeding or men who needed sleeping. Within a few decades, Newcomen engines were pumping water out of mines across England. And then, around 1764, a young instrument maker at the University of Glasgow named James Watt was asked to repair a model Newcomen engine used for teaching demonstrations. As he worked on it, something bothered him. The engine was wasting enormous amounts of energy because the cylinder had to be heated up with each stroke of steam and then cooled down with each injection of cold water. All that heating and cooling, it was thermodynamically absurd, even though nobody had formalized thermodynamics yet. Watt didn't have the theory. He had the intuition. And his solution was elegant. What if you didn't cool the cylinder at all? What if instead you let the steam flow out of the hot cylinder into a separate vessel, a separate condenser, where it could be cooled and condensed without ever chilling the main cylinder? This single idea, the separate condenser, is one of the most consequential engineering insights in human history. It roughly tripled the fuel efficiency of the steam engine. But Watt didn't stop there. Over the following decades, working in partnership with the Birmingham manufacturer Matthew Boulton, he added a double-acting mechanism so that steam pushed the piston both up and down, a centrifugal governor that automatically regulated the engine's speed, and a sun and planet gear system that converted the rocking beam's motion into rotary motion. That last one is crucial because it meant the steam engine was no longer just a pump. It could drive machinery. It could turn wheels and shafts and looms and lathes. It could power a factory. And that's exactly what happened. By the 1780s and 1790s, Boulton and Watt engines were being installed in textile mills, iron foundries, and breweries across Britain. Work that had been done by water wheels, which required you to build your factory next to a river, could now be done anywhere you could shovel coal into a boiler. Factories moved to cities where the workers were. Cities grew. Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds. These places exploded in population. The landscape of England transformed within a single generation. But the steam engine didn't just change where things were made. It changed what was possible to make. And to understand that, we need to talk about iron and about a man named Abraham Darby, who back in 1709, before Watt, before even Newcomen's engine was widely deployed, had figured out how to smelt iron using coke instead of charcoal. Coke is coal that's been baked to drive off impurities, and Darby's process at his foundry in Coalbrookdale, Shropshire, meant that iron production was no longer limited by the dwindling supply of forests for charcoal. It was limited only by how much coal you could mine and how much air you could blast into your furnace. And what do you think provided that blast of air? Steam engines, driving enormous bellows. More steam engines meant more iron. More iron meant you could build bigger, better steam engines. The feedback loop was extraordinary, and it was accelerating. Each turn of the cycle made the next turn faster. Better engines pumped water out of deeper coal mines, which produced more coal, which fired more furnaces, which smelted more iron, which built more engines. It's one of those rare moments in history where technology stops advancing in a straight line and starts curving upward, feeding on itself. And here's what made iron so transformative. For most of human history, iron was a structural material you used in small quantities: nails, tools, weapons, hinges. You didn't build large things out of iron because you simply couldn't produce enough of it cheaply enough. But by the late 18th century, with coke smelting and steam-powered blast furnaces, Britain was producing iron on a scale that would have been unimaginable a century earlier. In 1720, British iron output was maybe 20,000 tons a year. By 1800, it was over 200,000 tons. By 1850, it would be over 2 million. Think about that curve. That's not gradual improvement. That's an explosion. And once you have that much iron, you start thinking differently about what you can build. The first major iron bridge in the world went up in 1779, right there in Coalbrookdale, practically in Abraham Darby's backyard. Well, his grandson's backyard by then, Abraham Darby III. It's still standing, actually, spanning the River Severn. It's a gorgeous thing, a single arch made of cast iron, about 100 feet across. And it's a fascinating artifact, because if you look at it closely, you can see that the builders didn't quite know how to think in iron yet. The joints are designed the way you'd join timber: mortise and tenon, dovetails. They were using a new material, but still thinking with old habits. That happens a lot in engineering. When a new material or technology arrives, people first use it to replicate what they already know, and only gradually they figure out what it can do that nothing else could. But iron was about to find its true calling, and it wasn't bridges. Not yet. It was rails. The idea of running wheeled carts along tracks wasn't new. Mines had been using wooden rails for centuries to move ore carts, but wooden rails wore out quickly, especially under heavy loads. Iron rails lasted far longer. And once you had iron rails, The obvious question was, what if instead of horses pulling the carts, you used a steam engine? Several people were working on this idea around the turn of the 19th century, but the one who really cracked it was Richard Trevithick. Now, Trevithick is one of those engineers who deserves to be far more famous than he is. He was a Cornishman, big and strong. Reportedly, he could lift other men over his head, and he was obsessed with high-pressure steam. See, Watt's engines operated at very low pressure, just a few pounds per square inch above atmospheric. Watt was terrified of boiler explosions, and honestly, given the quality of boiler construction at the time, he wasn't wrong to be cautious. But Trevithick saw that if you could safely contain higher pressures, you could build engines that were far more powerful relative to their size, small enough and light enough to put on wheels. In 1804, Trevithick's steam locomotive hauled 10 tons of iron and 70 men along a tramway at the Penydarren Ironworks in South Wales. It worked. It actually worked. The locomotive itself held up fine, but the cast iron rails kept cracking under its weight. There's an irony for you. The iron that made the engine possible wasn't quite good enough for the tracks. It would take another couple of decades and the development of wrought iron rails before railways became truly practical. And that's where George Stephenson enters the story. Stephenson was self-educated, the son of a coal mine fireman, and he spent years refining locomotive design. His rocket, built for the Rainhill trials in 1829, wasn't actually the first locomotive, but it was the one that proved railways could be fast, reliable, and commercially viable. It averaged about 12 miles an hour during the trials, with bursts up to 30. That doesn't sound fast now, but at the time, the fastest most people had ever traveled was the speed of a galloping horse. The Liverpool and Manchester Railway opened in 1830, and it changed everything. Within 20 years, Britain had over 6,000 miles of track. By 1870, the railway network covered most of the country. Now, here's the thing about railways that goes beyond just moving faster. Railways were the first technology that required truly precise, standardized engineering on a massive scale. Every rail had to be the same gauge, the same width apart. Every locomotive had to fit those rails. Every coupling had to connect. Every bridge and tunnel along the route had to be built to exact specifications. This forced the development of precision manufacturing, standardized parts, and quality control in ways that nothing before had demanded. And railways required something else that might seem mundane, but was actually revolutionary. They required accurate, synchronized time. Before railways, every town in Britain kept its own local time, set by the sun. Bristol was about 10 minutes behind London. That didn't matter when the fastest thing moving between them was a horse. But when you're running trains on a single track in both directions, and you need to know exactly when a train will reach a passing point so another train can get out of the way, 10 minutes is the difference between smooth operation and a head-on collision. The railways forced the adoption of a single standard time across the country. Railway time, they called it, which eventually became Greenwich Mean Time. So the next time you glance at a clock and know it's synchronized with every other clock around you, that's a legacy of the steam locomotive. But let's pull back for a moment, because railways are just one thread in a much larger transformation that was happening in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The Industrial Revolution wasn't a single invention. It was a cascade, a whole ecosystem of innovations feeding each other, exactly like we talked about with the iron and steam loop. Textile machinery drove demand for iron and steel. Coal mining drove demand for steam engines. Steam engines enabled factories. Factories concentrated workers in cities. Cities needed sanitation, water supply, food distribution, each of those needs spawned its own wave of engineering problems and solutions. And textiles, honestly, are where the Industrial Revolution first showed its most dramatic social effects. The sequence of inventions is almost dizzying. John Kay's flying shuttle in 1733 doubled the speed of weaving, which created a bottleneck. Weavers could work faster than spinners could supply thread. So James Hargreaves invented the spinning jenny around 1764, which let one worker spin multiple threads at once. Then Richard Arkwright developed the water frame in 1769, which produced stronger thread using water power. Then Samuel Crompton combined the best features of both into the spinning mule in 1779. Each invention solved one bottleneck and immediately created another downstream, pulling the next innovation into existence. By the early 1800s, the British textile industry had been almost completely mechanized. A single factory worker operating power looms could produce as much cloth as dozens of hand weavers. The human cost of this was enormous, and we shouldn't gloss over it. Hand weavers who had been skilled, relatively well-paid artisans found their livelihoods destroyed within a generation. The Luddite uprisings of 1811 to 1816, when workers smashed machinery in protest, weren't irrational acts of ignorance. These were people watching their way of life evaporate, and they understood exactly what was causing it. The word Luddite gets used today as an insult, meaning someone who's afraid of technology, but the original Luddites had legitimate grievances. Their skills, honed over lifetimes, had been rendered worthless by machines that could be operated by unskilled workers, including children. Factory conditions were often brutal: 12, 14, 16-hour days, dangerous machinery with no safety guards, children as young as 5 or 6 working in mills. The wealth that industrialization created was real and vast, but its distribution was savagely unequal, at least at first. So why does this matter for the story of technology? Because it shows something important. Technology is never just a technical question. Every major technological change reshapes society, creates winners and losers, and forces choices about how the benefits and costs get distributed. That's as true today as it was in 1811. But the machines kept improving, and the materials kept improving with them. And this brings us to steel, which is really the material that made the modern world possible. Now, we've talked about iron, but iron comes in different forms, and the differences matter enormously. Cast iron, the kind that came out of blast furnaces, is hard but brittle. It shatters under sudden impact, like those rails that cracked under Trevithick's locomotive. Wrought iron, which is iron that's been hammered and worked to remove impurities, is tough and flexible, but relatively soft. What engineers really wanted was something in between: hard but not brittle, strong but workable. That something is steel, which is essentially iron, with a carefully controlled small amount of carbon, usually between about 0.2% and 2%. People had been making steel for centuries, but only in tiny quantities because the process was incredibly labor-intensive. You'd take wrought iron bars, pack them in charcoal, and heat them for days to let carbon slowly diffuse into the metal. Then you'd fold and hammer and fold and hammer. Beautiful steel, but you might spend a week making enough for a single sword blade. You certainly couldn't build a bridge out of it. The man who changed that was Henry Bessemer, and his story is one of those wonderful cases where a completely unrelated problem leads to a revolutionary solution. In the 1850s, Bessemer was working on improving artillery shells for the Crimean War. He designed a new type of spinning projectile, but the cast iron cannons of the day couldn't handle the higher pressures his shells required. He needed stronger gun barrels. He needed steel, but in quantities and at prices that didn't exist. So he set about figuring out how to make steel cheaply and in bulk. His breakthrough, patented in 1856, was almost absurdly simple in concept. You take molten pig iron, that's the crude iron straight from the blast furnace, full of excess carbon, and you blow air through it. The oxygen in the air combines with the carbon and burns it off. By controlling how long you blow, you control how much carbon remains, and you can hit that sweet spot that gives you steel. The whole process took about 20 minutes. 20 minutes compared to days or weeks with the old methods. The Bessemer converter, as it came to be called, was a pear-shaped vessel that could process tons of iron at a time, tilting to pour out molten steel in a spectacular shower of sparks. The effect on steel prices was dramatic. Before Bessemer, steel cost roughly 50 pounds per ton. Within a couple of decades, the price dropped to around 7 pounds. Steel went from a precious material used for cutting edges and springs to a bulk construction material. And that opened up possibilities that would reshape the skyline of every major city on Earth, because steel was what made it possible to build not just longer bridges and faster ships, but buildings that reached toward the sky in ways that stone and brick and cast iron never could. The first steel-framed skyscraper, the Home Insurance Building in Chicago, went up in 1885, and it was only 10 stories tall, which seems almost quaint now. But the principle it demonstrated, that a skeleton of steel could bear the entire structural load, with the walls serving merely as a curtain hung on that frame. That principle is the same one holding up every skyscraper you've ever seen, every glass tower in Manhattan, every soaring office block in Shanghai or Dubai. They're all descendants of that idea, made possible because a man trying to build a better cannon figured out how to blow air through molten iron. And steel didn't just go up, it went across. The great railway bridges of the late 19th century, the Forth Bridge in Scotland, completed in 1890, with its massive cantilever spans. These were steel structures on a scale that would have been fantasy a generation earlier. Steel went into ships too. The era of wooden warships ended, and the era of steel battleships began, and navies drove enormous demand for high-quality steel plate. Steel went into the cables of suspension bridges, into the rails that carried heavier and faster trains, into the machines that made more steel. But even as steel was remaking the physical world, another transformation was gathering force, one that would prove even more profound. And it started, as so many things do, with someone being curious about a phenomenon that seemed to have no practical use at all. In the early 1800s, several scientists were playing with the strange relationship between electricity and magnetism. Hans Christian Ørsted, a Danish physicist, noticed in 1820 that a compass needle deflected when he placed it near a wire carrying electric current. That simple observation, a twitching needle, was one of those moments that cracks open an entirely new world. Because what Ørsted had stumbled onto wasn't just a curiosity, it was a clue that electricity and magnetism, two forces that had seemed completely separate, were actually deeply, intimately connected. And once that connection was understood, once people figured out how to exploit it, everything changed. Not gradually, explosively. Now, Ørsted published his findings, and the scientific community went a little wild. Within weeks, André-Marie Ampère in France was working out the mathematics, showing that two wires carrying current exerted forces on each other. that electricity in motion created magnetic fields, and those fields could push and pull on other currents. This was new physics, and it was beautiful physics, and it attracted some of the sharpest minds in Europe. But the person who really took that twitching compass needle and turned it into something world-shaking was an Englishman named Michael Faraday. And here's the thing about Faraday. His story is one of the most remarkable in the entire history of science. He was born in 1791 into a poor family in South London. His father was a blacksmith who was often too ill to work. Faraday had almost no formal education. He left school at 13 and was apprenticed to a bookbinder. But he read the books he was binding, especially the science books, and he became fascinated by chemistry and electricity. He attended public lectures by the great chemist Humphrey Davy at the Royal Institution, took meticulous notes, bound them beautifully, and sent them to Davy asking for a job. Davy eventually hired him as a laboratory assistant, basically a glorified bottle washer. And from that position, through sheer brilliance and relentless experimentation, Faraday became one of the greatest experimental scientists who ever lived. No formal mathematical training, no university degree, just an extraordinary intuition for how the physical world worked, and an absolute genius for designing experiments that revealed its secrets. In 1831, Faraday made the discovery that arguably did more to shape the modern world than any other single finding in physics. He showed that a changing magnetic field could induce an electric current in a wire, not a static magnet, a changing one. Move a magnet through a coil of wire and current flows. Stop the motion and the current stops. This is electromagnetic induction, and if you think about it for a moment, you realize what it means. It means you can convert mechanical motion into electricity. Spin a magnet near a coil, or spin a coil near a magnet, and you get a continuous flow of electric current. That's a generator. That is, in principle, how almost all the electricity in the world is produced right now, tonight, as you're lying here listening to this. Whether the thing spinning the generator is a steam turbine heated by burning coal or by nuclear fission, or a wind turbine catching the breeze, or water falling through a hydroelectric dam. The fundamental principle is Faraday's: a changing magnetic field, a coil of wire, current flows, and the reverse is also true. Run current through a coil in a magnetic field, and you get motion. That's an electric motor. Faraday demonstrated the first primitive electric motor as early as 1821, just a wire rotating around a magnet. So with these two discoveries, the generator and the motor, Faraday had handed humanity the tools to convert between mechanical energy and electrical energy at will, back and forth, motion to current, current to motion, and that closed a loop that would eventually power civilization. But here's the thing, and this is important for understanding how technology actually develops. Faraday's discoveries didn't immediately transform the world. There was a long gap, decades really, between the scientific insight and the practical systems that could exploit it. Because to make electricity useful, you needed more than just the principle of a generator. You needed generators that were efficient and reliable. You needed ways to transmit electricity over distances. You needed things to do with it once it arrived. You needed an entire system, and building that system took the rest of the 19th century. The first practical application of electricity that really captured the public imagination wasn't power at all. It was communication. The electric telegraph. And this is where things get fun, because the telegraph is one of those inventions where multiple people in multiple countries were all converging on the same idea at roughly the same time, which tells you that the underlying knowledge had reached a tipping point. In Britain, William Fothergill Cooke and Charles Wheatstone developed a telegraph system in the late 1830s and installed it along railway lines. Which makes sense, right? Railways already had the infrastructure of long, linear routes, and they desperately needed a way to communicate between stations faster than a train could travel. But it was Samuel Morse in America who developed the system that really took over, partly because of its elegant simplicity. Morse code, dots and dashes, short and long pulses of current, could be sent over a single wire and decoded by a trained operator. By the 1850s, telegraph wires were strung across continents, and in 1866, after several heroic and expensive failures, a telegraph cable was successfully laid across the floor of the Atlantic Ocean, connecting Europe and North America. Think about what that meant. For all of prior human history, information could travel no faster than a person or an animal could carry it. A message from London to New York took weeks by ship. Suddenly, it took minutes. The telegraph compressed the world. It changed how wars were fought, how businesses operated, how financial markets functioned, how news was reported. It was, in a very real sense, the first internet, a network of wires carrying encoded information across vast distances at something close to the speed of light. And it was built on Ørsted's twitching needle, on Faraday's coils and magnets, on the accumulated understanding of electricity that had been building for decades. But communication was just the opening act. The real transformation came when people figured out how to use electricity for power and for light. And the person most associated with that transformation, though he was far from the only one involved, is Thomas Edison. Now, Edison is a complicated figure. He was brilliant, tireless, a genuine inventive genius in many ways. He was also a ruthless businessman, a shameless self-promoter, and sometimes took credit for work done by the people in his laboratory. But what Edison understood better than almost anyone else in the late 19th century was that invention wasn't just about the device, it was about the system. When Edison set out to create electric lighting in the late 1870s, he didn't just try to build a better light bulb, though he did that too, famously testing thousands of filament materials before settling on carbonized bamboo for his incandescent lamp. What he really did was design an entire electrical distribution system from scratch. He thought about generators, about wiring, about meters to measure how much electricity each customer used so he could bill them, about switches and fuses and junction boxes. He thought about the economics. He knew that electric light had to compete with gas lighting on price, so he worked backward from what people were paying for gas to figure out how efficient his system needed to be. He built the first commercial power station, the Pearl Street Station in Lower Manhattan, which began operating on September 4th, 1882. Supplying direct current to 85 customers in a 1 square mile area. It was a small start, but it was a complete system, and it worked. And this is where one of the great rivalries in the history of technology comes in, the so-called War of Currents. Edison's system used direct current, DC, where the electricity flows in one direction. It worked fine for short distances, but it had a fundamental problem. You couldn't efficiently transmit DC power over long distances. The voltage Edison used was low, around 110 volts, and at low voltage you lose a lot of energy to resistance in the wires over distance. So Edison's model required a power station every mile or so, which was expensive and impractical for anything beyond dense urban neighborhoods. The alternative was alternating current, AC, where the flow of electricity reverses direction many times per second. And the crucial advantage of AC was that you could use transformers to step the voltage up for long-distance transmission. High voltage means lower current for the same power, and lower current means less energy lost to resistance in the wires, and then step it back down to safe levels at the destination. The key figures on the AC side were George Westinghouse, a shrewd industrialist and inventor, and Nikola Tesla, a Serbian-American engineer of extraordinary brilliance and equally extraordinary eccentricity. Tesla had developed a practical AC motor and a complete polyphase AC system, and Westinghouse licensed Tesla's patents and championed AC power. Edison fought AC bitterly. He launched a public relations campaign arguing that AC was deadly dangerous, which, to be fair, high-voltage AC can indeed be lethal, but so can DC. Edison even secretly backed the development of the electric chair, which used AC, partly to associate alternating current with death in the public mind. It was ugly, it was dishonest, and ultimately, it didn't work, because the physics was against Edison on this one. AC was simply better for transmitting power over distances, and that mattered enormously. The decisive moment came in 1893, when Westinghouse won the contract to light the world's Columbian Exposition in Chicago with AC power, a dazzling display that showed millions of visitors what electric light could do. And then in 1896, when AC power generated at Niagara Falls was transmitted to Buffalo, New York, 26 miles away. That proved the concept at scale, AC-1, and the basic architecture of the electrical grid that powers your home right now, generators producing AC power, transformers stepping voltage up for transmission and down for distribution. That architecture was established in the 1890s and hasn't fundamentally changed since. Now, electricity didn't just give us light and motors. It became a universal carrier of energy, a way to deliver power cleanly and precisely to any point where a wire could reach. And that universality is what made it so transformative. In a factory powered by a steam engine, you had one big engine driving a system of shafts and belts that distributed mechanical power throughout the building. The layout of the factory was dictated by the physics of those shafts and belts. Machines had to be arranged around the power source. But once you had electric motors, each machine could have its own motor. You could arrange the factory floor however you wanted, optimizing for workflow rather than for proximity to a drive shaft. This seems like a small thing, but manufacturing historians have argued that it was one of the most significant productivity improvements in industrial history. And it took decades to fully realize, because factory owners had to rethink everything about how they organize production, and electricity enabled entirely new technologies that would have been impossible without it. The telephone, Alexander Graham Bell, 1876, used electrical signals to transmit the human voice. Radio emerged from the theoretical work of James Clerk Maxwell, who in the 1860s unified electricity and magnetism into a single elegant mathematical framework and predicted the existence of electromagnetic waves, which Heinrich Hertz then demonstrated experimentally in 1887, and which Guglielmo Marconi turned into a practical wireless communication system by the late 1890s. Each of these built on the last. Each depended on the accumulated understanding of electromagnetism that stretched back to Oersted's compass needle. But let's step back from electricity for a moment, because something else was happening in the late 19th century that would prove just as consequential. Something that started with a different kind of curiosity about a different kind of substance. while Edison and Westinghouse were fighting over currents, and while steel was reshaping cities and bridges and ships, a handful of chemists and engineers were beginning to figure out what to do with petroleum. People had known about oil seeping from the ground for centuries, even millennia. Ancient peoples used it for waterproofing and as a medicine. But it was in 1859, in Titusville, Pennsylvania, that Edwin Drake drilled the first successful commercial oil well, and that kicked off an industry that would, within a few decades, become the most powerful economic force on the planet. At first, the main product refined from crude oil was kerosene for lamps. It was cheaper and cleaner than whale oil, and the whales were getting harder to find anyway. But then, in the 1880s and 1890s, a new use for petroleum emerged, one that would reshape not just industry, but the entire geography of human civilization. Engineers in Germany, Carl Benz, Gottlieb Daimler, Nicholas Otto, were developing the internal combustion engine, a device that burned gasoline in small, controlled explosions inside cylinders to drive pistons. And unlike a steam engine, which needed a large boiler and took time to build up pressure, an internal combustion engine was compact, relatively lightweight, and could start quickly. It was, in other words, perfect for putting inside a vehicle. Benz built what's generally considered the first true automobile. In 1885, a three-wheeled contraption that his wife Bertha famously drove 66 miles to prove it was practical, making the first long-distance automobile trip in history, and along the way, inventing the concept of the road trip. But the automobile remained a toy for the wealthy until one man figured out how to make it affordable. And that man's story connects back to everything we've been talking about. Steel, standardization, the factory system, the whole arc of industrial technology converging on a single product, a single idea, that ordinary people should be able to own a machine that moves them across the land faster than any horse, anytime they want, wherever they want to go. Henry Ford didn't invent the automobile. He'd be the first to tell you that. What he invented was a way to build them so efficiently, so relentlessly, so cheaply that a factory worker, one of his own factory workers, could afford to buy one. And the way he did it drew on nearly every thread of technological progress we've wandered through tonight. Think about it. He needed steel. Cheap, reliable, high-quality steel, the kind that Bessemer and his successors had made possible. He needed standardized, interchangeable parts. The idea that Honoré Blanc had demonstrated with musket locks back in the 18th century, and that the American system of manufacturing had refined through the 19th. He needed electricity to power the tools and light the factory floor, the kind of power that Tesla and Westinghouse had proven could be transmitted over long distances. And he needed something else, something that doesn't get talked about enough. He needed a radical reimagining of how human labor relates to a machine. Ford's great insight, and it really was great, even if the man himself was deeply flawed in ways we'll touch on, was the moving assembly line. He didn't invent assembly lines from scratch. Meat packing plants in Chicago had been using disassembly lines for years, where a carcass moved along an overhead rail and each worker removed a specific cut. Ford looked at that process, essentially flipped it around, and applied it to building something up instead of taking something apart. Starting in 1913 at his Highland Park plant in Michigan, he arranged the production of the Model T so that the car's chassis was pulled along a line by a chain, and each worker along that line performed one specific task: bolting on a wheel, attaching a fender, tightening a particular set of nuts. The time it took to assemble a single car dropped from over 12 hours to about 93 minutes. That's not a small improvement. That's a revolution in manufacturing. And here's what happened to the price. When the Model T was introduced in 1908, It cost about $850. By the mid-1920s, after years of assembly line refinement, the price had dropped to around $260. Adjusted for inflation, that's roughly the equivalent of $4,000 today. A new car for $4,000. Ford was producing nearly 2 million Model Ts a year by that point, and by the time production ended in 1927, over 15 million had been built. The automobile went from a luxury to a utility, from a curiosity to a necessity in barely 2 decades. But the assembly line had a cost, and it wasn't just measured in dollars. The work was monotonous, soul-crushingly monotonous. You stood in one spot and performed the same motion, the same task, hundreds of times a day. Workers hated it. Turnover at Ford's plants was astronomical in the early days, something like 300% annually, meaning he had to hire 300 people for every 100 positions just to keep the line running. Ford's solution was characteristically bold and self-serving at the same time. In January 1914, he announced the $5 day, more than doubling the prevailing wage for factory work. It was headline news around the world. Workers lined up by the thousands outside his gates. The turnover problem vanished almost overnight. Now, Ford framed this as generosity, and in some ways it was. He genuinely believed that his workers should be able to afford the products they made, and he understood, perhaps intuitively, something that economists would later formalize: that higher wages create more consumers, and more consumers create more demand, and more demand creates more production, and more production creates more jobs. It's a virtuous cycle, at least in theory. But Ford also used that $5 day as a tool of control. To qualify for the full wage, workers had to submit to inspections of their homes and personal lives by Ford's so-called sociological department, which checked whether they were living in clean houses, saving their money, avoiding alcohol, and generally behaving according to Ford's rather rigid moral standards. It was paternalistic in the extreme. And as Ford aged, his views grew darker. He published viciously anti-Semitic material. He resisted unionization with hired thugs. He clung to the Model T long after the market had moved on, nearly destroying his own company in the process. Genius and cruelty lived side by side in that man, as they have in so many figures who've shaped the technological world. But anyway, the point is this: Ford's assembly line, whatever its human costs, established the template for 20th century manufacturing. And when you combine mass-produced automobiles with mass-produced petroleum, because the oil industry was scaling up just as fast, with companies like Standard Oil building vast networks of refineries and pipelines and filling stations, you get something unprecedented in human history. You get a civilization built around personal mobility. Roads get paved, suburbs get built. Shopping centers appear at highway intersections. Drive-in restaurants and drive-in movies and drive-through banks. The entire physical layout of American life, and eventually much of the world's, gets reorganized around the assumption that every adult has access to a car. That's not just engineering. That's the engineering reshaping culture, geography, economics, even the way people fall in love, because suddenly you can date someone who lives 30 miles away. And all of this, the cars, the roads, the oil, was happening alongside another technological revolution that was just as transformative, maybe more so. While Ford was perfecting his assembly line, two brothers from Dayton, Ohio, were solving a problem that had obsessed humanity for millennia: how to fly. Wilbur and Orville Wright weren't the first people to attempt powered flight. They weren't even the best funded. Samuel Langley, the secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, had a $50,000 War Department grant and a team of professional engineers, and his aircraft, the aerodrome, crashed into the Potomac River 9 days before the Wrights' first flight. The Wrights ran a bicycle shop. Their total expenditure on the flying problem was somewhere around $1,000. But they had something Langley didn't: a deep, systematic understanding of the actual engineering challenges involved, built up through years of patient experimentation. Here's what's really clever about the Wrights' approach. Most people trying to build airplanes at the time focused on power: build a bigger engine, generate more thrust, and the thing will fly. The Wrights realized that the real problem wasn't power, it was control. Getting into the air was one thing, staying there, turning, keeping your wings level in a gust of wind, that was the hard part. They spent years studying how birds adjusted their wings in flight, and they developed a system called wing warping, where the tips of the wings could be twisted slightly to change the amount of lift on each side, allowing the pilot to bank and turn. That principle, controlling an aircraft by altering the shape or angle of the wing surfaces, is still the fundamental basis of how every airplane in the world is steered today. The ailerons on a modern jetliner are the direct descendants of the Wrights' wing warping. On December 17, 1903, at Kill Devil Hills near Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, Orville Wright made the first sustained, controlled, powered flight in a heavier-than-air machine. It lasted 12 seconds and covered 120 feet, less than the wingspan of a modern Boeing 747. By the end of the day, Wilbur had flown 852 feet in 59 seconds. Within 2 years, they were flying circles over Huffman Prairie outside Dayton. Within 6 years, they were demonstrating their aircraft to kings and presidents. And within 11 years of that first flight, airplanes were being used as weapons of war over the trenches of France. The speed of that progression, from 12 seconds of flight to aerial combat in barely a decade, tells you something important about how technology accelerates. Each new capability doesn't just add to what came before, it multiplies it. The airplane needed the internal combustion engine, which needed petroleum refining, which needed steel drilling equipment, which needed blast furnaces, which needed... You can trace the chain all the way back to those first smelters working copper and tin in the ancient world. Every technology stands on the shoulders of every technology that came before it, and the stack keeps getting taller, and the things you can do from the top of that stack keep getting more extraordinary. And that acceleration only intensified as the 20th century rolled on. The 2 world wars, for all their horror, were engines of technological development on a scale never seen before. Radar, jet engines, synthetic rubber, nuclear energy, antibiotics, electronic computers, all of them either invented or dramatically advanced under the pressure of wartime necessity. The first general-purpose electronic computer, ENIAC, was built during World War II to calculate artillery firing tables. It weighed 30 tons, filled an entire room, and contained over 17,000 vacuum tubes that burned out constantly. But it could perform 5,000 additions per second, which was faster than any human or mechanical calculator that had ever existed. And then, in 1947, 3 physicists at Bell Labs, William Shockley, John Bardeen, and Walter Brattain, invented the transistor, a tiny semiconductor device that could do everything a vacuum tube could do, but was smaller, cheaper, more reliable, and used far less power. That single invention set the stage for everything that defines our modern technological world. Everything. Your phone, your laptop, the internet, GPS satellites, medical imaging machines, the computer controlling the traffic lights on your street, all of it traces back to the transistor. And the story of how transistors got smaller and cheaper is one of the most remarkable engineering sagas in history. In 1965, Gordon Moore, who would go on to co-found Intel, observed that the number of transistors that could be fitted onto an integrated circuit was doubling roughly every 2 years, and he predicted that trend would continue. It did. For over 50 years, it did. This became known as Moore's Law, and it's the reason a smartphone that fits in your pocket today has more computing power than all of NASA had when it sent astronauts to the moon in 1969. Think about that for a second. The guidance computer on the Apollo spacecraft had about 74 kilobytes of memory. Your phone has billions of times more. The engineers who designed that guidance computer, people like Margaret Hamilton, who led the software team and literally coined the term software engineering, they got astronauts to the moon and back with less computing power than what runs your alarm clock. And now here we are, you and I, at the end of this long, winding story. Or not the end, really. There's no end to this story, because it's still being written every day by engineers and scientists and tinkerers and dreamers all over the world. People are figuring out how to make solar cells more efficient, how to build batteries that store more energy, how to edit genes with precision, how to print three-dimensional objects from metal powder, how to train artificial intelligence systems that can recognize faces and translate languages and, well, narrate stories about the history of technology, if we're being honest about it. But here's what I keep coming back to. Lying here, thinking about all of this. The thread that runs through the whole story, from those first stone tools chipped on the banks of an African river 2.5 million years ago, to the microprocessor humming inside the device you're listening to right now. The thread is the same. It's someone looking at a problem, really looking at it, and thinking, what if I tried it this way? What if this material worked better? What if I shaped it differently? What if I combined this thing with that thing? It's curiosity married to persistence, and it's the most human thing about us. More human than language, maybe. More human than art. Because even before we could speak, even before we could paint on cave walls, we were picking up rocks and thinking about edges, and every single object around you right now, every surface, every material, every system that keeps you warm and safe and fed and connected to other people, all of it is the accumulated answer to billions of those small questions asked by people whose names we mostly don't know across thousands of generations, on every continent, in every era. The farmer who first noticed that certain seeds grew better in certain soil. The potter who figured out that a hotter fire made a harder pot. The smith who discovered that a little carbon turned iron into steel. The weaver who saw that a machine could do in minutes what took hours by hand. The telegraph operator who realized that information could travel faster than any horse or ship. They're all part of the same story. Your story. Our story. So let that settle over you now, like a warm blanket. All those centuries of ingenuity, all those late nights in workshops and laboratories, all those moments of frustration and breakthrough and quiet satisfaction when something finally works. They're the reason you're comfortable right now, the reason the air around you is the temperature you want it to be, the reason someone you love can be 1,000 miles away and still feel close. Technology isn't cold. It isn't impersonal. It's the warmest thing we do. It's us reaching across time, handing something useful to the next person in line, saying, "Here, I figured this out, and maybe it'll help." And the next person takes it and improves it and passes it on and on and on, all the way to tonight, to this quiet moment, To you drifting off with the whole long, beautiful history of human cleverness, murmuring in the background like a river that never stops flowing. Let it carry you now. You don't need to hold on to any of it. It'll all still be there in the morning, the bridges and the circuits and the engines and the code, still working, still holding, still doing what some thoughtful person designed them to do a long time ago, or maybe just last week. The world is full of quiet engineering miracles, and they'll keep watch while you sleep.